Welcome, everybody, to the new show, the Swingman Fields Roundup. Greg Amsinger with Harold Reynolds and Dan O'Dowd. And on each episode of the Roundup, we will be going over matchups from the previous week, previewing the matchups for this up-and-coming week, and giving you an updated power rankings entering Week 2, brought to you by FantasySP.com. Harold, why don't you get us started with the first Week 1 matchup?
Our first matchup in Week 1 was between the Mets and the Cardinals, with the Mets taking an 8-3 victory over the reigning champs. Both of these teams have made major moves, with the Cardinals making a trade for Yordan Alvarez to cover left field, and the Mets boosting their rotation by trading for Jacob deGrom. I fully expect these two teams to be serious contenders for the top spot all season long. The Mets had an offensive wash against St. Louis, taking all 6 offensive categories, only losing saves, holds, and ERA. The Cardinals look to get the bats on track, with notable names struggling so far like Alex Bregman, Alejandro Kirk, and Trey Turner. These two teams have a rematch Week 12, and the Cardinals are hoping for a much different outcome.
Our next matchup was between the Braves and Reds, with the Reds taking a commanding 9-2 victory over Atlanta to start the season hot. The Reds pitching staff was absolutely incredible all week, taking every pitching category and recording a jaw-dropping 131 strikeouts. This game was a lot closer than the 9-2 score would depict it as being. The Braves were within spitting distance of every offensive category besides home runs, but only ended up taking stolen bases and runs. Unfortunately for them, the Braves had an unlucky matchup against an absolute juggernaut and would have won this game against almost any other team. A very impressive showing from these two teams overall in Week 1, as they both have strong playoff aspirations. The Braves look to bounce back from a tough loss, and the Reds look to keep the momentum going. Over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Greg. Our third matchup was between the Brewers and Orioles. The Brewers had a very impressive showing despite missing several key pieces like Bryce Harper and Carlos Rodon due to injury. Milwaukee took this one over Baltimore 8-3. The Orioles only took the runs, RBI, and saves categories. Edwin Diaz missing the year for the Brewers will leave them shorthanded on saves. But what they clearly lack in saves, they make up with a dominant hold performance. The Orioles are even more injury-riddled than the Brewers, missing 9 players due to injury, including important pieces like Jose Altuve and new offseason addition Max Fried. Their pitching was lackluster Week 1, but getting Fried, Gonsolin, and Severino back will certainly help them in the pitching categories. Milwaukee had a strong showing Week 1 and looks to keep the momentum going in Week 2.
Next up, we have the Cubs taking an assertive Week 1 win over the Blue Jays 11-0. The Cubs absolutely just took care of business in this one. The bats started hot, led by Gleyber Torres, who has started the season absolutely on fire with 3 homers and 5 stolen bases. The pitching staff absolutely dominated in all the quantity-based categories like wins, strikeouts, saves, and holds. They weren't quite as good on the rate-based stats like average, OPS, and ERA. However, they put up good enough numbers there to take the categories. The Blue Jays, after unloading Jacob deGrom and Yordan Alvarez for a plethora of prospects like Riley Green, Spencer Torkelson, and Vaughn Grissom, look to be out of the hunt this year. They also received pitchers with huge upside like Chris Sale and Alek Manoah. With Wander starting the season like an elite fantasy option, the Blue Jays look to be much more competitive next year with that cap space.
Our next matchup was between the Angels and White Sox. This one wasn't very close at all, with the Angels taking this one 10-1. The Angels had a dominant first week, clearly winning every category, but stolen bases and keeping strikeouts close. While their week may be a little inflated against a struggling White Sox team, they still had a very good performance overall and would probably win if they played most other teams. The White Sox had major offensive woes in Week 1 with an ice-cold Kyle Schwarber and struggling Manny Machado and Ozzie Albies, to name a few. The Angels look to take their dominant Week 1 win into a matchup with the Mets, where we will see if they have a legitimate playoff chance, while the White Sox look to bounce back Week 2 against the Braves.
The last Week 1 matchup was by far the closest one we had all week between the Padres and Rays. The Padres narrowly escaped this battle, taking the 5-4 win over Tampa Bay. The Rays pitching staff kept them competitive through Week 1 with another absolutely huge strikeout total at 127. With Fernando Tatis not back from his suspension yet, Brian Reynolds took on most of the offensive burden and kept them close offensively. But the Padres' dominant bats was just too much for a depleted Rays offense in this one, with San Diego taking 4 offensive categories and tying 1. With O'Neal Cruz out for 4 months, the Rays now look for an answer at shortstop and hopefully an offensive upgrade to keep them in the hunt during Cruz's absence. The Padres escaped this week with a win and hope to get better headed into Week 2.
That wraps up the week one matchups, guys. Let's get into the week 2 previews. Up first, we have the Rays visiting the Cardinals. Both of these teams are looking for bounce-back weeks, and the Cardinals' offense is especially looking to take advantage of a cooled-down Brian Reynolds and lack of depth at shortstop, while Tatis is still out. However, the Rays look to have the upper hand in the pitching department, with a lot of the Cardinals' quality pitching options being injured to start the year. This one looks to be an interesting matchup for a long-time rivalry.
Up next, we have the Angels visiting the Mets. The Mets proved they were ready to compete in Week 1 and look to keep up at that high rate in Week 2 against the Angels. The Angels had a great Week 1 against the White Sox and look to prove that they can compete with the top-notch teams and have the ability to make the playoffs. Two teams with a lot to prove here in Week 2 look ready to go at it with their rosters firing on all cylinders.
Our next matchup has the Cubs visiting the Orioles. The Orioles look to bounce back from a disappointing Week 1, but are up against the absolute wrong team. The Cubs have been nothing but red hot since the start of the season and are looking to be one of the top teams in the league, if not a championship favorite, if everyone can stay healthy. The Cubs look to stay on top of the standings headed into the matchup against the Orioles.
The Braves travel to face the White Sox in Week 2. After a rough luck Week 1, the Braves look to prove themselves as a playoff contender in Week 2 against a White Sox roster who hasn't put it all together yet. The White Sox are hoping a lot of their bats can show a lot more than they have early in the season, but the Braves are a formidable foe, leaving the White Sox with a tough path to redemption.
The Brewers head to Cincinnati to face the Reds, who have been nothing short of spectacular early in the season. The Reds look to stay hot against the Brewers, who had a good Week 1 against the Orioles. As the Brewers face the tough matchup, they hope to get a little bit more on the offensive side of the ball to stay competitive. The Reds minor leaguers haven't had the strongest start with Henderson and Volpe slow out of the gate, but Walker will be up with the Reds soon, creating a force to be reckoned with.
Our last Week 2 matchup is between the Blue Jays and the Padres. The Padres look to have a major Week 2 against a Blue Jays roster that has moved most of its high-value pieces in favor of younger, more controllable assets for cheap. The Padres are still up there with the top teams and look to prove it here against the Blue Jays here in Week 2. Meanwhile, the Jays look to see some of the young guns have a breakthrough.
Fantastic stuff here, guys. Before we wrap up the inaugural episode of the Roundup, we will take a look at the updated power rankings brought to you by FantasySP.com. Some notable movers we have are the Cubs moving up from number 5 to number 3, and the Padres moving from 3 to 5. However, both of these are nothing in comparison to the Angels moving up 4 spots from 12 all the way to number 8. And after moving DeGrom and Alvarez, we see the Blue Jays fall from number 8 down to the bottom at 12 as they gear up for a much better 2024 season. All right, guys, this has been a fantastic time here with all of you today. This is Greg Amsinger along with Harold Reynolds and Dan O'Dowd wishing you guys luck in your Week 2 matchups. We will see you next week for another episode of the Roundup.